Are live. Today we have, for your viewing pleasure, what was billed to me, honest to God, as the newest, coolest thing in the secular community. We were having a stream on Saturday night, and all these Christians are like, you got to get this guy, Joe Schmid, on your channel. He's so smart. He's so talented. He's so great. He's really nice. So I was like, all right, guys, calm down. I'll send John to see if he wants to be interviewed. So we have here the newest, coolest thing in, I guess, are you an agnostic, Joe, or are you an atheist? What do you call yourself?
I'm just an epistemic agnostic, so we can go into that in more detail later, but.
Okay, cool. So the newest, coolest thing in epistemic agnosticism, Joe Schmid. Woo, woo. You want to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and tell us what you do.
Yeah, so yeah, like you said, I'm Joe. I'm a student at Purdue University. I major in philosophy and I minor in biology. And yeah, what I do is mainly just philosophy and truth seeking, really. And so, yeah, with respect to philosophy, I've got a blog called Majesty of Reason. I work on that, occasionally and write some blog posts and attract a lot of viewers there. And then I also have a YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason, where I do lecture style videos. I also do interviews with different guests and discussions / debates with different guests. Usually they're professional philosophers. And oftentimes ones that I'm like good friends with or have co-authored things with and so on. And then, so yeah, that's the YouTube. And then, yeah, school, like I said, Purdue University, Boiler Up. It's got a great philosophy program. We got Dr. Paul Draper there. He's really big in philosophy of religion. Got Dr. Michael Bergman, Dr. Jeff Brower, and some really good PhD students. And with respect to my sort of non-public philosophy life, I mainly just write papers and things like that. So I've got a lot of papers under review. I've recently finished co-authoring a paper with Dr. Graham Oppy on Edward Feser's Thomistic proof for God's existence. And so
cool.
Fingers crossed that gets accepted. And I've got a bunch of other papers under review.
Now you had Josh Rasmussen. I watched that video with him. Is he a friend of yours?
Yeah, Josh and I. Yeah, we're really tight. We're cool. We're cool.
Okay, good. So tell us a little bit about what you were raised Christian. Is that correct, or tell us a little bit about your journey, if there was a deconversion involved and things like that. So were you raised Christian first off?
Yeah. So I grew up in a sort of conservative Catholic home and very devout. My whole family and I went to Catholic education, basically. K through 8 was Catholic school, and then for high school, I went to a Catholic high school. And yeah, of course, now I'm at Purdue. And somewhere along the way, of course, something happened. Now, I was always really interested in like discussing and debating with people, things like that. And the interest kind of shifted over the years. So I remember when I first got my like iPod Touch or something, I would always go on Instagram because, I downloaded that. I mean, obviously I want to get social media because all my friends are doing it, but I'd always go on Instagram and I would always be like debating people on like abortion. I was really interested in that when I was in like 5th, 6th grade. So I was always debating with people. Yeah. And of course I was like pro-life and, things like that. And so naturally that led me into other discussions and debates online. And usually it was really cordial. It's not like anything like, calling each other names or anything. Usually it was very sort of, I guess,
more civilized than what you see on like Twitter now.
Exactly.
Were you like a conservative Catholic at this point? Are you religious? It sounds like you're a little bit like
religious. Yeah, very religious. So I'm currently at like 5th, 6th grade of the story. So, as it goes on in 7th grade, I get introduced to like evolution. And of course, evolution is taught in our classroom. And what was really interesting is that we actually watched the debate between Ken Ham and
oh, no way. Yeah. On YouTube. I remember that. Yeah. I watched that.
So fun. We would take notes and we would we'd like write a paper on it, and we'd talk like, even in our science class we'd talk about like faith and reason and how they interact with one another, because it's like a Catholic school, and so it's like theology and philosophy was kind of embedded in things, and so that kind of got my philosophy.
Well, but they were trying to how like was that, because that might have been your beginning of you starting to deconvert. If you watch that debate, were you starting to go like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And was your school reconciling like evolution with the Bible or not? Was it like more fundamentalist or?
No, absolutely, yeah. So Catholics, I believe, like Pew surveys show, like Catholics, among some other Christian groups, but Catholics are like the most accepting of evolution, which is wonderful because
Okay.
nature and, well, according to Catholics, nature and the Bible and divine revelation, they have this single source of truth, and so they can't really contradict one another, and so there's this sort of mutual engagement and interaction between the two, such that there's only one truth, and it's God's truth, according to the Catholic framework. And so, yeah, it was definitely, they were totally on board with evolution and things like that.
Okay.
And yeah, God sort of played an active role in it and so on. And so I got really captivated, right? I got really interested in evolution. And I started like picking up different books on the evidence for evolution. Now I'd start like debating people online about evolution because I was firmly like believing of it, right? Because I saw all this evidence for it, and I was just so excited about it because it was so fascinating how all this tremendous biological diversity around us arose from such simple beginnings, right? I mean, it's so beautiful. This development and this process of growth and becoming, and it was just so beautiful to me. It like when I just looked at my hand, it was just like, this is the product of millions upon millions of years of evolution. And I thought it was so beautiful. And so I would like read biology textbooks and things for fun. So that's where the biology comes in, right? Because I said I minor in biology. So I'm still interested in it. But that really, that sort of
started the ball rolling.
Yeah, that started the ball moving. Because once you do that, you start getting into discussions about religion. And, I really tried to reconcile it with, the Genesis accounts. And I do think that they're reconcilable, at least prima facie. And what happened really was I don't know when it happened, but it was somewhere around 9th grade, maybe. I started thinking about, well, hold on a second, right? The evolutionary process is rife and fraught with suffering and languishing and predation and parasitism and carnivory and horrendous animal suffering. And so I really had to start grappling with this. I was like a theistic evolutionist, right? I thought God utilized the evolutionary process, and I was like, man, this is the very mechanism by which God brought about humans. And it seemed, this started, making me think about problems of evil. And I was like, this animal suffering, this hundreds of millions of years of sheer horror in the animal kingdom, it was very difficult for my faith. And that sort of, again, that snowballed into all these other...
It's funny because there's an atheist guy who John and I are friends with, who I've done like a few streams with. And we had this thing where I was going to try to give him these like religious rituals to participate in and see if he finds that he has a God experience from them. But as we were talking over the preparation for it, one of the things that he found most challenging is that idea, because he's, it's so, in nature, so violent, and like, it just seems so like destructive and cruel, the functioning of like, just every day, lion eats a zebra. So that's what you're talking about, right? That's what I'm hearing. Is that what you mean? That started to prey on your mind? Like,
yeah,
how could this be?
Yeah, that it was that in conjunction. Well, once you start the ball rolling, you read internet articles, you start doing discussions with people, you're talking with people at the lunch table, you're reading books, and you're starting to get into philosophy of religion, and then you find all these debates online. So it's a spiral. But it all did kind of start with being interested in evolution and its relation to religion, but then really kind of reflecting not only on animal suffering, which a lot of the sort of normal theodicies for humans are difficult when you apply them to animals. Not only the sort of profound extent and profusion of animal suffering, but also its sort of temporal duration, right? Like, it's not as though we're talking about a couple hundred years where this was occurring without humans. I mean, we're talking about not just 1,000 years, not just 10,000 years, not just 100,000 years, hundreds of millions of years. And that was just really, really, really difficult to grapple with in an intellectual manner. And so that really put me down the path of philosophy.
So how much of a believer were you before this started happening? Were you religious in terms of what? Doctrinally religious? You were committed? Were you a prayerful person? Give us some of the idea of like, if the question makes sense. I don't know if that question, did that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Okay.
That's a wonderful question. I was definitely doctrinally religious, prayerfully religious, the spiritual life and everything and so on. Yeah, I was definitely really
Did you feel like you had a personal connection to God? Like, did you feel prayers answered in the heart of God when you like ministered to friends or something?
Yeah, so I'm not sure like if I had anything like a prayer answered, or a sort of profound religious experience or anything along those lines. But, you know,
Okay.
I did feel like I knew God, and I was in a relationship with God, and things like that. So that I definitely
Okay.
did. That definitely was an element of it. Now, most of it was kind of, I guess, heady, as it were, you know, like just my dispositions as a person. I was mainly interested in like the doctrinal stuff. So like, because, you know, we had
Right.
theology classes every day, which I'm grateful for.
Fair
So
to say,
grateful
fair to
for.
say you're a pretty cerebral person, correct?
Yeah, yeah,
You're pretty
pretty much.
much.
I mean, that's not to say I ignore the other things, but like just as like dispositionally, as you know, a lot
Yeah.
of philosophers are.
I kind of get that. Yeah. Yeah, I would actually, so is Josh Rasmussen. It was funny listening to you guys chat because it was like egghead to egghead. It was very certain way of both of you were communicating with each other was interesting to me. Okay, so take us to, you start off as an atheist and now you're an agnostic. So explain what's happened in the journey and what you believe and how it all came about to the best of your ability. I know it's not that easy to do, but to the best of your ability.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So again, we kind of stopped off at like 9th-ish, 10th grade-ish,
Right.
where you know, everything sort of broke down, and now I'm kind of, you know, discovering more and more arguments. I found Jeff Lauder and the Secular Outpost online. I'm starting to get interested in philosophy, thinking of my own problems, talking with priests at my high school, debating at the lunch table.
Oh, interesting. What are those conversations like? Are you struggling with the questions and bringing them to the priests?
Well,
Or
it depends, like, because, you know, I have theology teachers, basically like theology classes every day in these things, and so
right.
like oftentimes I'd like maybe stay after class and, you know, talk with some of the problems with theology teachers, or, you know, I'd like schedule you know, like sometimes we have free time, and so I'd schedule my free time with a priest or someone else who teaches theology.
Would you say you're wrestling or you're just curious? Like, are you angst about it, or you want these answered, or you're struggling, or you just kind of, this is an interesting question, I want to chat?
It was mostly like wrestling, and I can't quite remember all the details, because again, this is sort of like 9th-ish, 10th-ish grade. Yeah, I can't quite remember all the details. I mean, like,
Okay.
I was like formulating arguments at the same time, and like I found arguments convincing, so I was like trying to discuss in a sort of cordial manner, and like discuss some of the arguments that I thought up or come across, regarding like naturalism,
Pro-theological
atheism.
arguments, or secular arguments for secularism, or arguments for God?
Yeah, arguments for like naturalism or atheism that I was like
Okay.
encountering and thinking up and so on. So I was like just testing ideas. It was all really about sort of testing ideas, really, and just conveying with other people, seeing if some of these things could be answered, if they could withhold scrutiny, and so on. A lot of the arguments that I had encountered that were sort of pushing me and inclining me towards atheism at the time. And so really, as I sort of, you know, researched this stuff further, I got closer and closer to a sort of robust metaphysical naturalism, which is just to say that, you know, the only things that exist are spatiotemporal things. The spatiotemporal world is causally closed, and so there's, according to this view, there is no such thing as God or angels or demons or anything like God. A sort of so that's what I was sort of getting attracted to, and it was really on the basis of Jeff Lauder, his arguments, Paul Draper's arguments, and a lot of different other philosophers that I was starting to get acquainted with around 10th grade. And so I was shifting way more towards a robust metaphysical naturalism around 10th grade. It started as started as kind of atheism, and then it shifted towards a more philosophically informed kind of metaphysical naturalism. And then in maybe 11th-ish grade or something like that, maybe a little later towards 11th-ish grade, you know, I'm still researching these things in depth because it just interests me so much. So like, I'm reading books, I'm watching debates, I'm discussing with people online. So this is all going on in the background for all of these things. And I came across certain theistic philosophers, and I was starting to take their objections and their arguments more seriously. And so one thing that I came across was, for instance, that was really influential was Josh Rasmussen and Alexander Pruss's book, Necessary Existence. And
Oh,
so,
interesting. Okay.
yeah, I picked that up and I read it, and I was like, this is super cool. Like, these are arguments that I'd never heard before. These are cutting edge philosophy. I need to reevaluate my metaphysical naturalism. And so after really delving into these things more, reading more of Alexander Pruss, reading his book on the principle of sufficient reason, reading more like contingency style arguments, getting more into these kinds of, getting more into the philosophical weeds, as it were, I started seeing the more robust metaphysical and philosophical merits to theism as a sort of worldview or a framework. And so I was starting to appreciate it further. And that kind of destabilized my metaphysical naturalism such that I was moving closer and closer towards agnosticism. And again, this is a gradual process. Along the way, I'm like emailing a bunch of people with, you know, questions and objections. Like Josh Rasmussen, he and I have gone like hundreds upon hundreds of emails back and forth because I got super interested in his work. I found his YouTube channel. We were going back and forth on like modal cosmological arguments. And yeah, so I developed a relationship with him. And, you know, so as a result of all of this, I sort of came to appreciate the merits of theism more. And now that sort of brought me in 12th grade, finally, senior year, I sort of shifted back towards agnosticism, and it's kind of persisted from then till today.
So how do you define it? Because I know you're aware of the debates over the defining of it. How are you defining that for yourself? And what's the difference?
Yeah. So in one of my recent videos, it's entitled something like "Why Am I Agnostic?" or something.
Yes. I didn't get to that one. I meant to.
The different definitions, and so I don't like to shamelessly plug, but I would suggest people to like look at that because I go through the different definitions on there. So for me,
you can shamelessly plug. So check it out, everybody. It'll blow your mind. He'll define it straight for you. You finally get an answer. Okay, go ahead. You can shamelessly plug. Shamelessly plug away. It doesn't matter to me.
Yes. Okay. Well, so I break agnosticism down into in-principle agnosticism, suspension agnosticism, and epistemic agnosticism. So in-principle agnosticism states that roughly, you know, it's in principle not possible to know whether or not God exists. You cannot know that atheism is true. You cannot know that theism is true. That's what that position says.
Wait, say that one more time. Let me make sure I got that. It's in principle not possible, or possible
kind of my terms.
No.
Yeah, these are my terms. So in principle agnosticism just says it is not possible in principle to know whether or not God exists. So it is not possible to know in principle atheism is true, and it's not possible even in principle to know that theism is true. Oftentimes they'll appeal to things like our cognitive limitations. Maybe the question is just beyond us. Maybe the arguments are just like a bunch of word salad. Maybe that's what they think. I don't find that convincing, but that's one kind of agnosticism, the sort of in principle agnosticism.
Oh, okay, that's not yours. Okay, I got you. I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And then a second kind of agnosticism is a suspension agnosticism. And this is just someone suspends or withholds belief one way or another, and they don't attach a determinate probability one way or another. So they don't say that, okay, well, maybe it's 60% probable that God exists, 40% improbable. So they don't really attach any probability towards the question. They just refrain from putting any probability.
Prior to me becoming a Christian, I was basically agnostic on the subject. More or less, I didn't care. I was kind of like, you know, whatever. God could easily exist, but I haven't met him, and I'm not interested. You know, why do we have beer for tonight? That was kind of my position on the subject. So that's similar to what you're talking about. That's how I am with like aliens.
Yeah,
could they be aliens? Of course, maybe. Exactly. Do I have a strong position one way or the other? No, don't really think about it that much. But I don't see why it couldn't be. You know, go ahead.
No, precisely. That's a perfect analog, because that's exactly what I take towards aliens, for instance. Like, I don't even know where to like put the probability assignment. Like, is it 60% probable? Like 50? I don't even know.
Yeah, so, like, you couldn't even say, because you don't know. I mean, given that the universe is basically infinite, I would say it's likely, I guess, but who knows? Go ahead.
Exactly. So that's a kind of suspension agnosticism. You don't put your cards really anywhere. You don't even say the probability, a determinate probability assignment. I'm also not that kind of agnostic. The third kind of agnostic.
Interesting. Okay, I thought you were. Okay, go ahead.
So the third kind of
first I thought you were saying you were the first type of agnostic. Like, that's
probably my fault.
Good. No, it's not. It's just, you know, it's just these are complex things. I'm just listening for the first time. So go ahead.
Yeah. So the third kind. So we went over the in-principle agnosticism, which I don't accept. We went over the suspension agnosticism, which I don't accept. And then the third kind is called epistemic agnosticism, and that's what I accept. That's what I was sort of talking about at the beginning when I was sort of like an epistemic agnostic. And so, really, what epistemic agnosticism is just you say, like, listen, we have looked at these arguments on both sides. We've evaluated their merits. We've weighed up the evidence on either side. And just roughly, we think on the basis of this evaluation, we think that the probability that God exists is just roughly somewhere in the middle. It's roughly something like 50-50. Maybe, you're somewhere in between 40%, 60%, maybe somewhere in between. It's a bit fuzzy, of course. But someone who's an epistemic agnostic is someone who does attach a determinate probability assignment, unlike the suspension agnostic. So the epistemic agnostic does say that they do take a stance on the likelihood of the being in question, namely God. And so what they would say is that, no, I do take a stance on this because I've evaluated, lots and lots and lots of evidence and arguments on both sides.
Right. And the question actually, as you're describing it, it seems like it's more important to you than it would be to it's actually something you think about a lot and you check the arguments for a lot and you're constantly examining the evidence. That's what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's an evolving process like this. So everything, it's all process, really. It's all a journey. That's how I see it. It's processive. It's becoming. It's a journey, really. You're never, at least for me, it's never sort of you stop, right? There's no ending.
Right.
Like no ending to discovery and to inquiry and to just learning about the fundamental nature of reality, really. And so, so I do attach a sort of determinate probability assignment, and that's why I'm an epistemic agnostic. And I do think it's roughly counterbalanced, something like that, upon evaluating the evidence from my own perspective. And that's another thing about justification. It's perspectival. That's not to say that truth is perspectival. It's a justification that's perspectival. We each have our own access to evidence that we've looked at and that are our intellectual seemings, what we've read, and that's unique to all of us. And so, the sort of justification is perspectival. And for me, my evaluation of the evidence leads me to think that it's roughly counterbalanced. So that's my position.
So justification being perspectival, let me ask you some questions about that, because that kind of fits with something I say a lot on my videos. There's the factual predicate for your belief, and then there's the emotional resonance to your belief. There's the thing that makes it emotionally compelling to you. And I'm coming to the conclusion that that's way more important than the actual factual predicates. What would you say about something like that?
Oh, that's interesting. So when you say way more important, could you elaborate on that? Do you mean way more important to the individual, or like more
to the individual, to what the individual? Yeah, like there's an objective standard of evidence, and I guess we all kind of. That starts to get complicated.
It does.
Because we don't. Yeah, that's why I realized I got to say this carefully, because you got someone who's actually thinking. There's an objective standard of evidence that can be evaluated, I guess, semi-objectively, if not quite objectively. But then there's things that compel you towards this evidence as opposed to that, and that seems to be like your emotional makeup.
Yeah, or your aesthetic impulses, right?
Oh yes, perfect. Okay, so tell me some of that, because it sounded similar to what you were saying about what you just said with the justification. What was the word you used?
Perspectival.
Yes, that sounds. You know who you'd like is John Vervaeke, by the way. He's a agnostic. He kind of combines neuroscience with philosophy. With that's the only place I've ever heard the word perspectival. That's what I'm thinking.
That's funny. No, that's a great question. I actually haven't really thought of that much.
So what's your channel about? Like how long have you had your channel, and what do you do? Are you on Twitter?
Oh, I'm not. I mainly do Facebook is really what I do for social media. But
so you send pictures of like your friends' kid, your pets, and what's your channel about? Is it just exploring? Is it like how would you describe it?
Yeah, so my channel, Majesty of Reason, is just basically like a general philosophy class with a specialty in philosophy of religion. That's really what it is.
Okay.
I've had people tell me that, like, hey, this is basically like a graduate seminar in philosophy of religion, and I'm like, oh, sweet, that's kind of what I'm aiming for. And so I mean, it's kind of like a mixture of lectures that I myself put together and give. It's also a mixture of interviews that I do with professional philosophers. It's also a mixture of discussions and debates, not only between me and others, but also between different professional philosophers. On
Who are
various
the best in the Christians would you say that you've interviewed? Josh, you're
so
friends with.
on my channel, I also have a friend's channel, Crusade Against Ignorance, and I've been on that one a lot as well. So out of everyone that I've talked to, the best is probably, Dr. Josh Rasmussen. And then, shortly following that, I'm probably forgetting someone, but, Dr. Ryan Mullins and Dr. Trent Doherty, both of them are definitely up there.
Oh, yeah. Trent Doherty. Okay, I've seen a couple of his debates too.
Hmm.
Now, it doesn't sound to me, this is a weird thing, but it doesn't sound to me like your channel is necessarily like an atheist channel in the sense of like you're trying to prove that God doesn't exist, or you're watching videos and going, see, I can debunk this. It
Yeah,
sounds like it's more just generally explorational
absolutely.
on the subject. Is that right? Yeah, that's what I'm
Absolutely.
hearing.
It's in the philosophical spirit, really. So it's really all about probing arguments. It's really all about testing arguments. It's about, probing ideas and exploring the nature of reality, really. It's not trying to justify or prove some sort of pre-existing conclusion.
Right.
It's trying to arrive at that conclusion. It's part of the process of arriving at that conclusion. So
Right.
some of my videos are sort of explorative. Some of them are descriptive. Some of them are argumentational or whatever, but it's all really in the process of exploring and to help other people and serve them think about and grapple these issues in much greater depth and complexity. And really,
okay, so here's where I'm going with this, because this is what I sense. You seem, I wouldn't use the word detached, but I would use the word, you don't seem as emotionally invested in the outcome as most of the agnostic / atheist type people that I engage with. Like, it doesn't seem like you have a really committed dog in the fight. It seems like you're more open-ended. Let's figure out what's true and let's find out what's true based on the quality of the argumentation. Is that right? Is that kind of what you're about, or no?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in my like published work and in what I actually like write on for philosophy journals, like the actual like big time, like real philosophy stuff, I mainly work on things like, well, it's all within metaphysics and philosophy of religion. And I work on things like models of God. So like, if God exists, what would his nature be like? So that kind of thing.
Okay.
I work on explanations of persistence. So why do things persist in existence, moment after moment after moment? So I work on that. I work on also.
So explain those two a little bit more. Just flesh them out a little so I understand what you mean. Models of God is what?
Yeah,
exactly?
yeah. So models of God is basically, if God exists, the question that it asks is, if God exists, what would God be like? Would God be, would he be immaterial? Would he be infinite? Would he be maximally perfect, or would he have various limitations? Would he be absolutely simple with no complexity or parts or distinctions or differentiation? Or
Right. So you understand all the classical theism, like attributes of God, Thomas Aquinas, all that. You're pretty well versed in that, right?
Yeah, that's actually kind of like my research specialty, really.
Oh, interesting. My wife asked me a question today. This is related because she, for some reason, was watching Thomas Aquinas. And I don't know why. It's never come up before. I think she was reading something about James Joyce, of all people, and then started asking me about him. And I gave her some information. I wasn't sure if it's right. A huge chunk of Catholic theology is heavily influenced by Thomas Aquinas. I'm pretty sure that's right. And then is he the first person who brought up those like arguments for classical theism? Is that where they originated from? They have a scriptural predicate, a lot of them, correct?
Yes, yeah. So there's a slight tweak that I would make to that statement. So Aquinas influenced the sort of the classical theistic tradition arguments, but he wasn't really
Aristotle
the primary, the primary source. When you actually go back to it, it originates in Aristotle and Plato primarily, both of those two. And then it gets developed, and Plato and Aristotle are sort of in some sense building on other thinkers before them, Parmenides and Zeno and them. But the main classical theistic arguments in broad spirit derive from Aristotle and Plato, and then they get developed further by like Augustine, for instance, and like a lot of people think they were sort of perfected, as it were, in Aquinas, and him bringing in new distinctions and new ways to, you know, synthesize the sort of Aristotelian elements with sort of Christian theism and so on. So.
Right. Yeah. I sort of knew that he was heavily influenced by Aristotle. As soon as I asked you the question, I was like, oh wait, I know that. Now, so models of God, is models of God just dealing with those type of models of God, or are you also dealing with other things like Hindu type models of God or the Tao Te Ching? You ever looked into any of that?
That's a good question. So, I mean, like in the literature, you can find stuff on that, but for my specialty, I don't really look into that. I mainly try to, well, it's probably a result of a bunch of things, namely interest, cultural heritage, and so on. I mainly look at Western monotheistic conceptions of God, really. So
Okay.
no, I don't really search or research that sort of Eastern stuff.
So what conclusions are you leaning towards with that? You're a secular person, so you're agnostic, but you've studied the attributes of God a lot, so you're well versed in it, right?
Yeah, very.
What can you tell me about that I don't know? I'm sure a lot, but just on the top of your head.
Yeah.
Like
well,
what should I know as a Christian?
Yeah.
What am I missing?
Yeah. So I'll basically give first. I'll just say what I think, what I lean towards accepting or thinking is more plausible, and then I'll sort of I'll basically.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's a great start. Okay.
Of what you should think. So I'll or how you can think about these things rather. So the first thing that I did want to just talk about was, you know, what do I think about these things? Well, there are a bunch of different models of God. There are, well, the two main ones that you'll see in Christian apologetics, and they're called by different names. But one of them, the first one is called classical theism, and then the second one is called modified or neoclassical theism, and some people call it theistic personalism, but that's not really found in the literature much. So I'll just call them classical theism and neoclassical theism. So those are the two main kind of models within at least Christian apologetics and, you know, sort of Western philosophy more generally. There are also panentheism and pantheism, but we can set those aside for present purposes. So,
you know, before you set those aside, T-Jump was in a debate and he used this he said, I would call myself a naturalist panentheist. And I was like, that's really interesting. I got to get him to explain what he means by that at some point, because that doesn't sound like an atheist to me. But go ahead. Now set them aside. Go ahead.
Yeah. So we can set those aside for just a second, but or for this conversation. So for me, between those two models of God, I find neoclassical theism much more plausible. So it's really sort of a conditional claim. Like if I were to be atheist, then I would probably be a neoclassical or modified classical theist.
Okay.
And that's mainly because I do a lot of research on classical theism and various problems for it. So I do think it faces a lot of really challenging, difficult problems.
What are the challenges? The problem of evil. So what can you give me I know it's a lot, but can you give me a general, like those are the attributes of God would be omnipotent, probably.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good. Let me give you the rundown. Okay. So
just summarize it briefly.
Because now, okay. So we covered the first one, right? Like what I lean towards for these things. So I talked about how I lean towards a non-classical or neoclassical view, and now I can sort of articulate the views in question and how I can give you some tools to think about them. So classical theism. It accepts all the core tenets of a sort of bare or core theism, which is just like God's omniscient, God's omnipotent, God is morally perfect, he's all good and all loving, right? He is independent for his existence. He doesn't depend on something else that produced him or caused him,
right?
And he is necessary. That is to say, he's a necessary being. He has a sort of robust existence that he can't go out of existence. So it's not like he exists on Tuesdays, but not on Wednesdays or something. He has metaphysically necessary existence. And that's kind of core to many different models of God. Now, what classical theism adds in particular are 4 distinctive divine attributes. Attributes in a broad sense. I'll touch on that in a second. So the first one is simplicity, and then I'll lay these out after I list them. So it's simplicity, timelessness, immutability, and impassibility. These are 4 core and distinctive divine attributes of the classical theistic research program. So divine simplicity says that God has no metaphysical or logical or ontological or physical parts whatsoever. And they actually have in mind a very specific conception of parthood. And that conception of parthood is that anything that is intrinsic to something or within something, like contained within it, but distinct from the whole, would be a part. So like a property, like I have the property of being a man, right? But I'm not identical to the property of being a man, right? Like I have other properties, like I have the property of having brown hair and things like that. So I have this property, but I'm not identical to that property. And so there's something in some sense within me, namely that property, that I'm not identical to, that Joe is not identical to. And so what the classical theist says is like, nope, that is a part, and God cannot have parts.
Right. No component parts whatsoever.
Yeah, nothing, no components whatsoever. And we're not just thinking like physical parts, but we're also thinking properties. We're thinking an essence, or an essence distinct from its existence. And we're thinking, distinct attributes and all sorts of things. So what they're going to say is that whatever is intrinsic to God, whatever is within God, is strictly speaking identical with God, such that there is only one absolutely simple, utterly undivided, with no differentiation or qualification or modification or intrinsic differentiation, simple nature or being or act. That's what God is. So all of God's properties would be identical. God is identical to all of his properties. Omniscience just is omnipotence for God, and God is identical to his existence. He's identical to every single one of his actions, such that
is immutability, is that inviolate? Like God cannot be different than what God is? Is that what immutability?
Yeah. And simplicity is the core, and those other three are entailed by simplicity, right? You get them for free. And so I'll move on to immutability now, right? So immutability says that God is utterly unchangeable. Like he not only can he like not change intrinsically, but he also doesn't change in his relation to other things. So he doesn't like stand in a relation. He doesn't, begin to be in a new relation or new relationship with something, because that would sort of create a succession in his life. He would go from something to something else, and that's not okay for immutability, this strong immutability. God does not go from anything to something else.
Right. So he can't be anything other than he is. And he's in relationship to everything else as exactly what he is and nothing different. So in a sense, it's like light. Light can't be anything else. That's the analogy I always use for that particular. God is like light. Light cannot choose to be dark for a little bit. It's just light. It emanates. It does what light does, period. Nothing different.
Exactly. It's just purely unchangeable. Well, how they articulate it is God is purely actual or pure act, which means he has no potential to change, to become, have new relations with things, no potential to become anything, to take on any new determination or actuality. He doesn't have distinct thoughts. He doesn't think something anew. He doesn't choose something anew, right?
Right.
I mean, so that's immutability. Right. And then timelessness just means that God exists without beginning, without end, without succession, without temporal duration or extension or anything. So God is just in timelessness. He has his whole life in this super abundant, timeless now, right? There's no succession. There's no before and after whatsoever for God. So God doesn't it's not
from everlasting. Everything you realize, everything that you are talking about has a scriptural predicate. From everlasting to everlasting, the beginning and the even the unchanging, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. All these attributes of God have scriptural, can be found in the Bible. I don't know if you knew that. Just go ahead.
Yeah. So then, so that's timelessness, and then impassibility says that God cannot be causally influenced or moved or affected by anything ad extra to the divine nature, anything apart from God. Nothing can influence him or move him. God is just fully self-sufficient. He doesn't like empathetically enter into the lives of others. No, he's perfectly self-contained, self-sufficient, and nothing influences him. He doesn't suffer. He just exists in this pure, timeless state of blessedness and happiness and sheer perfection. And just sheer happiness. So he doesn't experience any emotions that are incompatible with happiness. So he doesn't suffer. He doesn't empathize with your plights or things like that. He doesn't experience anything except for that blessedness and happiness.
So that one probably Christians have objections to, I would guess.
Many, so neoclassical theists think that impassibility is very, very difficult for a relationship with the divine and a sort of Christian conception of God.
Well, that one directly contradicts the attributes of God, like in the Bible. That one wouldn't match.
There's a lot of debate here. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I agree with you there, but scholars debate that. So it's not that's not a completely uncontestable claim with respect to scholarship. Personally, I agree with you there. I think it's well, you know, I'm
Right.
kind
So
of
how do you differentiate between, like, do you watch like the YouTube videos and like the Twitter atheists? Do you engage with that stuff at all? Do you keep abreast of it? Do you know
no,
what's
not
going
really,
on?
not
So
really.
you're okay. So you're almost completely in the like Josh Rasmussen, Dr. Graham Opie, Ivory Tower, and like
Absolutely.
because
Yeah.
you're. It was really funny. Before I forget, let's move on to your new atheist video, because I agree with almost everything you said in it, but so much of the things that you said would be so contested by Twitter atheists. Like there's some that, like, if you so you've never dealt with them at all, right?
No, not very much. I mean, like occasionally on Instagram, because I do Instagram a little bit. I've interacted with them, but I try to stay away from them.
Well, there's a lot of stuff that you just kind of blanketly stated about new atheists and about atheism in general that, you know, some of it's, you know, non-controversial, some would be like wildly controversial. But
Mhm.
okay, but let's finish up on your attributes of God thing. So that's you, what you find the most plausible interpretation of God. And then the impassibility, you're saying that that's heavily debated within the academic community.
Well,
But
a
I
quick
would
note.
imagine most preachers intuitively go, that can't be, because we talk about a God that suffers with humanity and cares
Mhm.
about you and
Mhm.
empathizes. Now, you might be meaning it in a more intellectual way, but you understand what I mean, though, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm still sort of articulating the classical theistic model of God, which I personally I don't think is very plausible. I think there are some strong objections to that. So I'm still kind of articulating that package. Um, and
I thought you were giving me the one that you found most plausible. Okay, I'm sorry.
yeah,
All right.
we'll no, it's cool, it's cool. So we'll get to that one next. So yeah, so those were the main four distinctive divine attributes that classical theism adds. And I mean, personally, I do think that you are right, that there are good arguments. I actually have a video coming out on divine impassibility with Ryan Mullins sometime soon on my channel. And we talk about a bunch of different problems for divine.
And he's a Christian?
He is a Christian, but he's a sort of a neoclassical or modified classical theism, the one that I said I find more plausible than classical theism. So yeah, so now I guess that's a good bridge into neoclassical theism. So
Okay.
neoclassical theism affirms that core of theism, right? Remember, I was talking about that core, which is omniscience, omnipotence, moral
Right.
perfection, omnibenevolence. God's independent. He's metaphysically necessary. He's perfectly free and rational. Pretty much all models of God affirm those, for the most part. You'll
Right.
find some detractors here and there, but for the most part, models of God affirm that. Neoclassical theists and classical theists agree on that. Now, remember, classical theism added those four distinctive divine attributes. What neoclassical theism does is basically just like, nope, screw those. What we're going to do is we're going to say God is not absolutely simple. There is some differentiation in him. He might have distinct properties. So his omniscience might be really distinct from his omnipotence, which many people intuitively think like, yeah, I mean, omniscience seems to be different from omniscience, right? Many people think
Right.
that. So they're going to reject simplicity. They're going to say God has some sort of complexity or differentiation of his being. They're
Yeah,
going to
with
say,
just with regards to simplicity, I've never really felt like I've understood it enough to decide one way or the other. But
it's very complex.
Yeah, I've never really like tracked with it. I've never been like, yeah, that's definitely a thing, you know, because I never
Very
really felt like I got the idea well enough. But
Well,
anyways,
I'm
go ahead.
glad you said that. I'm glad you said that because it's actually really difficult to grasp and conceptualize. Because I mean, this is the limits of human cognition and reasoning, but it's actually very, very, very difficult to like. If you read the literature on it, it gets highly technical and highly complex really fast. So you definitely have to wade and like wade through a bunch of different philosophical underpinnings before you can really understand that sort of the literature there. It's difficult, and I recognize that. So yeah, so for the neoclassical theistic, again, so they're going to deny simplicity. They're going to say, no, God's not immutable. God has some potential. He doesn't have a potential not to exist. He's a necessary being, but he has some potential, like he might have the potential to become incarnate, or he might have the potential to gain new knowledge. Like he went from knowing that it is now 7:26 p.m. Eastern time to knowing that, well, in 2 minutes, maybe, he will go from knowing that it is 726 to knowing that instead it is 728. So he'll have some potential to change his knowledge. He might have potential to become incarnate. He might have various potentials not related to his very being, but he won't be utterly unchangeable or utterly immutable. For that's what the neoclassical theist says.
Right.
They also are going to want to deny timelessness. So they are going to say that God exists without beginning and without end, because he's a necessary being. He can't come into existence or go out of existence, right? Because he's a necessary being. And so what that means is that God exists without beginning and without end. But what they're going to say is that he's temporal. And what that means is that God has succession in his life. So God sort of experiences something from one moment to the next. And, you know, they're very
So he is in time at the same time that he's timeless. Is that kind of what that means? That he is in time.
They're going to reject timelessness. Yeah. So they're going to say, no, God doesn't transcend, or he isn't outside of time. It's not as though time constrains him. He's actually the creator of time. And on different models, they conceive of time differently. Time might be an attribute of God, or time might be something that God like sort of concurrently creates and so on. But that's sort of getting into the metaphysics of time. But what they're going to say is he's not timeless. He doesn't exist outside of time or just in this immutable, timeless present. He is within time, and he experiences becoming like we do. So he goes through time, and he persists through time and sustains the world in being. And he also, you know, persists in time. So he's temporal, he's mutable, but he's still a necessary being, and he's still the creator. And so they're going to reject timelessness, and they're also going to reject impassibility. So they are going to say that God can suffer. God can really empathize with our plights and our suffering. God knows really, truly what it is like to suffer. He himself, you know, a bunch of different things. You know, God's going to be able to experience these emotions, at least so far as they are consistent with perfect rationality and perfect moral goodness. So God,
right.
Yeah, they're basically going to say God can suffer, contra classical theism. So that's the neoclassical God. You know, Josh Rasmussen leans toward that kind of conception. William Lane Craig leans toward that kind of conception. A bunch of different theists do, and there are, you know, a bunch of different Christians are on either side of this divide, the classical theist versus neoclassical theist. I happen to lean towards this neoclassical theist if I were a theist, right?
And that's the one that you find most plausible. Now, have you, when you did, you've done more than one debate where you played the theist, right?
I've done one, yes. It was a devil's advocate debate, yeah, where we take a position that we don't necessarily agree with, but we try to steelman it and argue for it and fend off objections to it. So yeah, that was on Capturing Christianity with Randall Rouser. It was really fun.
Yeah, so I would imagine you'd be pretty good at that, because you seem to have a pretty thorough. See, what you are not doing, which a lot of other atheists and secular people do, is you're not learning to debunk. You're not gathering information so that you can readily dismiss it as this cannot be. You know, you're gathering information so that you thoroughly process it and understand it correctly. Correct?
Absolutely.
So that you could write a book on it, both for it and against it, from both sides of like classical theism. So you could probably successfully argue both sides, is what I'm getting from just talking to you, right?
Yeah,
probably be pretty good at arguing both sides.
Well, I think so. I hope so, right? I mean, it's all sort of in the service of truth. Yeah.
Is Oppie like that too? Because he seems more like, I see him more in atheist debates debating, and is he more like that too? You strike me as more neutral.
Okay, so Oppie,
which I think is a good thing.
Yeah. So that kind of goes down to my being an agnostic and Oppie's being a naturalist or an atheist. So he does kind of, when in discussions, debates, he kind of takes on the atheist or naturalist side, and he discusses that. He doesn't like to do debates or call them debates. He likes discussions and exploring things and testing things as well. So so that's I think your sense there derives from the fact that he actually is a naturalist or an atheist and not an agnostic, whereas I am an agnostic. And he would he would be very competent in debating both sides. I can tell you that. He knows the arguments in and out like the back of his hand. I'm telling you.
Interesting. How was Randall at debating, at being an atheist? Was he good?
I mean, I love Randall. I guess I'm partial because I've known him for a little while and I'm a big fan of his and I really like him. So he was a good atheist. I mean, I really
could say no. He'll hear this, but didn't say no, he
No,
sucked. He was
good. I mean,
terrible. He
no,
basically said no. Randall was on the show 2 weeks ago. He gave us a thorough schooling in Reformed epistemology. That's one of the things that I had him talk about a lot. Do you know anything about that, by the way?
Reformed epistemology. So I know the broad outlines. I know the broad outlines of proper basicality and the different, theories of justification and warrant and so on. I know the broad outline, but I don't do research in epistemology, so I can't go in too much depth there.
So what do you research? What specifically are you researching? The two things you mentioned. This is what was it? The theories of God,
Yeah.
models of God, and that's mostly in terms of monotheism, kind of mostly Christian monotheistic versions, right? And what was the other thing you said?
Yeah, mostly just a Western monotheism and really classical theism and neoclassical or modified classical theism. So both of those, the interplay between them, different problems for either of them. That's part of my research, like models of God, things like that. Because ultimately, I think that has a bearing on whether or not God exists. Because it's God's nature or character if he did exist. And so,
well, so when have you debated the problem of evil from either side?
I have, yes. I have defended a version of the problem of evil from animal suffering. It was in a debate. I mean, I don't like the term, but it was in a discussion with Dr. Trent Doherty. It's on my channel. If you go to playlists, you can click
cool.
playlist.
Yes, I'd like to check that out. Were you taking the side that you're actually on, though? You weren't playing devil's advocate?
Because I do think that, I wasn't playing devil's advocate, because I do think that for my mind, it kind of is a plausible problem for theism, because it's that evolutionary animal suffering thing. I was defending.
Right. Well, it's interesting, because the only problem of evil that you've talked about thus far is probably the only problem of evil that I take seriously, in terms of I can understand why it would create a real conundrum with somebody who is not a believer. Whereas some of the other ones that get brought up, I'm like, those are kind of easily solved, guys. If you factor in some form of free will or some form of volition in part of like the people participating in the evil. I'm not sure if that quite made sense how I just said it, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know that definitely makes sense. And that's really why a lot of thinkers are pushing more towards like a lot of these theodicies for humans are very difficult to adapt in the case of animals.
Because the theodicy for human is really easy to explain if you factor in human volition and human free will. Whether you believe in it or not, you still can factor it in. But then when like a tidal wave strikes Indonesia, evil has been visited to everyone who got hit by the tidal wave. How do you explain that? It looks to the untrained observer. It looks to you, the secular person, like a random universe, correct?
Like if I'm wearing on my glasses of being a naturalist or an atheist, it does seem more probable that reality would be indifferent like that than on theism.
Right, that a tidal wave strikes because the earth shook, the tidal wave hit.
Doesn't care about it, like things like that.
Right. Well, that one I totally understand, and that I don't know that it's necessarily hard to philosophically justify. Here's what I'm pretty sure you'd agree with this. You don't think that God exists necessarily, but if God did exist, then there would be a fairly easy way to answer that. Whether that answer could be understood by a human being is a totally different thing.
He would have some reason. He would have some justifying reason to allow it. Yeah. Yes.
And who knows, if you factor in people get salvation, then it's like, who cares? Maybe everyone who gets hit by a tidal wave goes to heaven, and then there wouldn't really be all that upset. Well, I got hit by a tidal wave. Well, now you're in heaven forever and ever and ever. All right, fine, I'll take it. You know what I mean? So now let's talk about new atheists. Tell me some of the thing in that video, and be gentle, because if the atheists are listening, they're gonna bristle. You'll have them actually in your comment section, like, you douchebag, how dare you?
Yeah. So before doing that, I like to distinguish between new atheists or new atheism and atheism simpliciter. I see these as very sharply divided. New atheists, it's kind of a particular strand of atheism. It's a little bit more, in general, again, generally speaking, it's a little bit more vitriolic. It's a little less philosophically inclined. It has a little bit more incautious rhetoric. It's a little bit more I guess, shall we say, inclined towards scientism. That is to say, the view that science is the
Right.
only
It's
reliable.
popular. It's popular atheism. Most of the atheists that I experience, and most of the people listening to me, and most of the atheists listening, are heavily influenced, whether they know it or not, by the new atheist way, by like Dawkins, Sam
Yeah.
Harris. Sam Harris, Dawkins. I don't know if you know about atheism here on the ground floor with like, but there's a couple of main players, Matt Dillahunty,
Yeah.
Aaron Rock, heavily influenced by Dawkins, Sam Harris,
Yeah.
Christopher Hitchens, and they take some of that same approach with them. They popularized it out here in YouTube land and Twitter. And so you have a whole army of people that are really heavily influenced by them. You don't seem to be at all, even a little, like even a tad. I doubt Graham Oppie is either.
No, yeah, that's why I like to do that sharp divide. So, I mean, the thinkers on this divide are going to be something like, yeah, like Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens, Dennett in some cases, not in all cases. Dennett is, after all, he has published philosophical work. So Dennett is
Yes.
respectable. Michael Shermer sometimes, different people, like, but especially, it's like the Dawkins, Harris, Hitchens type. It's really these three. And again, these are broad brushstrokes. They don't apply to all new atheists. I do not like caricaturing, and I do not like, these broad sort of generalizations.
Right, I agree. I'm just saying
it's a general tendency. Yeah,
influenced by this move. Influenced by this movement, because what they did, whatever you think about the quality of their thought and the quality of their thought towards atheism, what they did inarguably is popularize it. Absolutely. And start these type of, because most of the people that we interact with are doing it on the ground floor, building their own YouTube channels and coming up with their own ideas. Yeah. But they're heavily influenced by by some of those ideas, heavily.
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's the sort of the new atheism. So this distinction, like the new atheism and then atheism as such, which I guess this is a subset of this, but atheism more broadly, or at least philosophical atheism, you're not looking towards Dawkins and Hitchens and, Harris and things like that. You're looking towards J.L. Schellenberg, Graham Oppie, Paul Draper, Wes Morriston, Felipe Leon, all these different robust philosophical thinkers, J.L. Mackie, J.H. Sobel, Nick Trakakis, Stephen Meitzen.
And you know some of these people personally, right?
Yeah,
they've been on your channel.
Yeah, I mean, like Oppie, for instance, like he and I, we co-authored a paper. It's currently under review. Fingers crossed that it gets published. But
cool.
Yeah, we like he
and you're 19 years old. Is this true? Are you actually 19?
Well, I turned 20 2 weeks ago. So.
Oh, okay. So
I'm in my
20s. It's no big deal. Oh,
basically have
he's 20, guys. Not a big deal.
I basically have gray hair, back pain. I'm feeling it.
Yeah, you're shooting up there, man. It's all downhill from there. 20, soon you'll be 21. Forget it.
But yeah, so like these thinkers that I just listed, the J.L. Schellenbergs, the Paul Drapers, and so on, these are the thinkers that I want atheists to pay attention to and to listen to. Like, these are the guys you need to read and to listen to and to absorb your information from.
So what are they bringing to the table, and how? This is, everyone listening, take this with a grain of salt. This is overviews, generally speaking, what are they bringing to the table, and vice versa, the new atheist influence, and what do you see?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna start with the new atheists, at least. In my video, I go through different benefits that they brought. So I do think that they brought a lot of benefits, but there are a lot of philosophical mistakes in their thinking. And again, generally speaking, not all of them. But one of them is scientism. So scientism says that science is the sole reliable guide to reality. It is the only path to knowledge, as it were. Scientism is false because it's self-defeating. Number one, you can't perform some scientific experiment. Like, look at your pressure gauge or your Geiger counter, and you can't be like, oh, hey, look, scientism is true. Like, I just read that Geiger counter and it told me that scientism is true. Like, no, scientific experiments and science itself cannot show that scientism is true. And hence, per its own criterion, it entails that scientism itself is undermining it. It entails that it can't be knowledge. That's one problem. Another problem is that science itself presupposes more foundational assumptions that cannot be justified by science, again, because any scientific inquiry presupposes them. So that there exists an external world, that other minds exist, that our sensory faculties are reliably truth tracking, that our memory is reliably truth tracking. none of these things can be tested or proved by experiment, because any experimental results already presuppose them. They already presuppose that your memory is reliable so as to remember what you recorded and, you know, things like that. They already presuppose that your sensory apparatuses are reliable and so on. So science rests on a whole host of foundations that science itself cannot justify. And what that means is that if scientism were true, it undermines the very foundations of science and hence science itself. So scientism is very, very, very wrong, and it's prevalent, at least scientific inclinations, it's very prevalent in a number of new atheists. That's one problem. Another problem is just misdefining atheism as a sort of lack of belief in God. I don't think that that's a good definition at all. I discussed that in my new atheism video. Mainly
you get
because,
a lot of pushback from that.
well, I mean, just think about like agnostic.
I see them fight over that every single day on Twitter for like days on end, because there's a whole school of atheists that wants to define it as lack of belief. Now, let me see if this is what you think the problem is. All that's telling you is the person's psychological state towards the proposition God exists, God does not exist. Not saying anything about the ontology. Is that the issue?
Well, that's one issue.
Is that the issue?
I think there are lots of issues. I mean, that's definitely one issue. It's like, okay, cool. Like, we don't really care too much about your psychology.
What you believe,
about your psychology. Let's talk about like ontology, or at least, you know, how the evidence bears on the ontology, such that the probabilities, we can speak about the probabilities of the evidence given various hypotheses and so on. So that's one problem. It's like they're talking about a different point. Like, that's your psychological state. Like, cool. Like, we don't really care. but okay. So ignoring that, you know, at least it's very crude. So when you're doing philosophy, a definition is, you know, cast in terms of an if and only if clause. So that is to say, what this definition says is that S is an atheist if and only if S lacks belief in God. They're saying that is both necessary and sufficient. That's what a definition is. Now, there are clear counterexamples of this. All you need to do is
wait. Slow down. Is that actually a philosophical definition of defining? Did you just give me what philosophy says a definition actually is?
Well, a definition is supposed to be a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something. So, for instance, knowledge, okay. S knows that P, like, how do we define knowledge? Well, S knows that P if and only if S has justified or warranted true belief. Now, there are gettier cases. Ignoring those, that's getting ahead of myself. But that's how definitions go when you're trying to systematize them.
But I'm just making sure I understand you clearly. You gave me a working philosophical model for what a definition actually is, because that's very precisely what a definition actually is. So if a definition doesn't fit those criteria, it is not strictly speaking a definition. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. So we can start testing this. We can say, okay, can we find counterexamples to that? In order to find a counterexample to that, you have to find, remember, it was S is an atheist if and only if S lacks belief in God. So we've got these two things. In order to falsify that, all we need to do is find something that satisfies this one, but that doesn't satisfy this one. Or, on the contrary, something that satisfies this one that does not satisfy this one. Okay? And so, you know, how can we do that? Well, one obvious example is things like the universe or rocks. These things lack belief in God because belief isn't even a proper term for them, right? It doesn't even make sense, and hence they lack belief in God, but yet they're not atheists. It doesn't really make any sense to say that they're atheists. They don't even have a cognitive capacity to consider the question.
I'm like chuckling to myself, and anybody who's seen the debates of the last 3 weeks is chuckling to themselves too, because that's exactly what they're debating. There are people out there who are saying rocks, in fact, are atheists. So...
Well, that's just a reductio of your view. But anyway, if your view entails that, I mean, you know, it would also entail that utter non-being or nothingness is an atheist. And that's just absurd, because utter non-being or nothingness lacks a belief in God. It lacks everything. It lacks being, and hence it lacks belief in God. But now you're trying to say that nothingness or non-being is an atheist? You're literally trying to predicate being an atheist of something that isn't even
I'm not debating you. I'm just telling you that there's a debate over exactly what you're saying.
No, I'm saying you as in the people who think that rocks are atheists.
Yeah, I know. It's just so funny, because I promise you this was like a 4-day, 5,000 tweet storm with sides and arguments, and like this would have blown your mind.
Well, that's just one problem. So, you know, they might alter it. You know, you can start altering the definition, but that's a clear counterexample. Another thing is, take an agnostic, an epistemic agnostic like me. I'm very far away from atheism. I do not affirm atheism. I don't claim that God doesn't exist. I don't claim that naturalism is true. Like, I'm very open to God. Even people who are who lean towards thinking God exists, but they're not really sure. They don't know. They don't.
They
fully
lack a
believe.
belief in
Yeah,
God.
they don't
according
fully
to that
believe,
criteria.
but they might lean towards it, right? They might be like, yeah, I mean, it might be 64% probable maybe that God exists. So they don't have a full-on belief. They're not at like 80, 90, 100% confident. They don't believe it, but they even lean towards thinking that God exists. And hence,
Right.
it'd be absurd to say that they're atheists. What are you talking about? They even lean towards thinking that God exists. You can't say that that is an atheist. So there are just so many counterexamples, and I could go on and on and on and on and on about how bad of a definition this is, philosophically speaking. And, you know, this isn't contestable within philosophical circles. If you pick up, you know, philosophy of religion books, if you pick up Graham Oppie, you pick up things that are actually getting by peer review and they're being published by Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and so on, you'll actually see that the real definitions are not things that have to do with lack of belief or like your psychological state, because they have these counterexamples.
Right.
So sorry, I'm getting a bit too passionate, but that's because I think that this is wrong, and very much so.
No, it's cool. You can get passionate. You know, I'm hearing some people get passionate in response. I don't know what they're saying, but I can feel them. And I can actually snippet this out and play it for some people. They'd be like, ah! But I'm not sure what their objection would be. You know, be as passionate as you want. It's cool. Totally cool. Go.
So yeah, well that's so I guess I pinpointed two problems: scientism and lack theism. Defining atheism as lack theism. I mean, there are lots of other problems, but you know, those are my main.
Well, you don't seem to be very generally anti-theistic. You don't strike me as got any particular emotional baggage when it comes to Christianity. Am I reading you wrong? I don't sense any.
Wrong. I mean, I think it'd be nice if, you know, there were like, if universalism, if Christian universalism were true, I think that'd be wonderful. I mean, I kind of want that to be true, but you know, so yeah, that's another thing that's a part of the new atheist. It's like, at least in general and often, it's more on the kind of vitriolic side. It's more on the polemical side. It's more on the tribalistic side, and that's really
right.
what I try to militate against that. I try to argue, you know, I don't try to use that strategy. In fact, my book, you can probably see it right there. I talk about how you can sort of overcome tribalism and polemicism, and how to have productive and loving dialogue across ideological barriers, which I don't really see modeled very well by the new atheists.
So how do you do that? Let's take us into that. So what are some ways? No, definitely they don't at all. What? Yeah. Go with that. What are some of the ways to have productive conversations across ideological barriers, would you say?
Absolutely. So let's do a little game. Pick a number between 1 and 22. Just pick a number.
Okay. Out loud?
Yes.
17.
Okay.
Was I wrong? Did I do it wrong?
No, I'm just going to read tip number 17 in my book, because I give 22 tips.
Oh, 22 tips. Okay.
Yeah, 22 tips. So tip number 17 says, well, it's all right, in fact, preferable to go slowly. Philosophy and truth-seeking in general is best done slowly. Clever, gotcha type remarks only alienate your dialectical partner. It's better to avoid such gotcha phrases. So really, this is all about trying to get out of the heat of the moment and trying to sort of be more reflective and be a little bit slower and more, at least, you know, slow to speak, quick to listen, things like that. You know, go slowly. Philosophy is best done slowly. Don't do these sort of clever gotcha type remarks. It's like if someone asks you, hey, as an atheist, how do you ground a morality? And then you just say, oh, well, you think morality should be grounded in the Old Testament God? He's a megalomaniac.
Right. He's
statist.
The first time somebody pulled that on me, it totally blew my mind, because I had no idea that people even did that. And I was friends with this girl, and she was an atheist. I really liked the girl. And you know, we were just chatting, and she brought up the problem of evil, and I said something along the lines, something that I'd thought about, and I said it to her, and she's like, "Oh my God, where do I even start? God floods the earth and drowns babies." I'm like, "What on earth? What is?" She gave me this whole barrage of talking points that I wasn't used to, and I was like, "What on earth is this coming from?" And I was like, "Whatever."
It's all about that barrage. Like, that's what this is saying. Like, no, go slowly. Like, don't do these clever gotcha type remarks. Like, don't do these snide little, you know, things that are only meant to be corrosive to the other person. No, go slowly, build them up.
Well, but that's the bread and butter of that certain type of, like, you know, debunk, dismiss, discredit is the name of the game. Put on your debunk, dismiss, discredit hat and gotcha somebody and pin them. You know, that's a huge chunk of that's a problem with the Twitter culture, because it kind of has too much of that.
It encourages
But-
it most, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it does encourage it. Yeah, that's
Twitter's
fair to
so
say.
small. I mean, you only get those little tiny blocks of text, and you get all the people liking it, and it's like the feedback in your nervous system. Anyway,
Right. So okay. So give me number 4.
number 4. Okay. Yes. Tip number 4: be willing to learn from your dialectical partner. Everyone, I'm going to repeat that. Everyone has unique experiences, perspectives, and worldviews from which we can gain value and insights. Don't go into the conversation with the sole aim of trying to convert or convince them. So that one is all about recognizing that everyone has value to bring to a conversation. And when you strip them of that value, when you just see them as a target that you can just convert, or that you can destroy,
Right.
or that you can debunk as this target, and not someone with value that can bring to the conversation, you're going to be hindering insight flow. It's all about being willing to learn from that other person, and really don't go into the conversation this mindset like, oh, I need to convert them, I need to convince them, I need to, no, sit back, relax, try to seek truth together, try to learn together. Do not go with this sort of pre-existent aim to convince or convert. That's the main thing, and learn from them.
Right. Okay. 7.
7. Okay. So this one says, we can't rid our biases, but we can modify dialectical contexts. That's just to say contexts in which we find ourselves conversing with people or dialoguing with people. So we can't rid our biases, but we can modify dialectical contexts to mitigate them. So create a welcoming, respectful environment where truth and love are center stage, really. So what this means is that don't have a sort of context of your conversation be one where it's your tribe riled up and the other tribe riled up and like going at it as sort of butting heads.
Right.
Instead, try to have this like welcoming, respectful environment where it's truth and love center stage, not like trying to build up your tribe that's center stage. And this is almost like, it's almost like a gamification, right? Like it's almost as though you gamify discussions so that you can score points against your dialectical partner, against the person you're discussing.
Totally, but that's exactly what's happening.
Exactly.
And tribalism is a key reason why. And actually, a lot of people are really into it. There's a reward system in place where you shut somebody down. Wow, you really wrecked that dude.
Exactly.
That there's a whole. Now, why are people so into it the wrong way, and why are you not like that? Is it because you value truth more than conflict? You're not tribal, you don't see yourself as an agnostic necessarily, or an atheist as part of a collective? I'm just throwing out ideas. Grab anyone.
That's a wonderful question, and unfortunately the answer is just that it's part of our human nature, really. It affects all of us to varying degrees, of course, but it affects all of us, these sorts of biases and inherent tendencies toward us versus them thinking, in versus out. You're the part of the in-group or part of the out-group. You plant your flag and you defend your flag. Unfortunately, it creeps up in all of us. And so you have to, the antidote is really to recognize it. You need to be able to, you need to be educated on our various biases and to recognize it. Second of all, you need to immerse yourself in different perspectives so that you can gain that sort of appreciation of the value that others can bring. That immersion and that perspective taking is very important, and that's actually supported in the psychological literature. Perspective taking is kind of like a buzzword, but that's because it's actually found in the psychological literature to be an effective way to at least help mitigate these kinds of tribalistic tendencies.
Okay, how would you perspective taking? That sounds doable and useful. What is that exactly?
Yeah, so it's kind of like immersing yourself, like hopefully on a daily basis, in contexts where it's a non-echo chamber context. So echo chambers is when you just surround yourself by people who agree with you, and maybe they're of the same race and gender and the same political association and so on, same religion. That's a sort of echo chamber context. So what you have to do is you have to immerse yourself, not only intellectually but empathetically, emotionally, spiritually, maybe, with those of different backgrounds and worldviews and life experiences. Listen to a variety of podcasts or watch a variety of videos. Don't just imbibe one-sided information from like a single single atheist source, say, or single Christian source.
I used to do that all the time politically. I used to make sure I cross-referenced the story of the day with like the voices on the right versus the voices on the left, just to get the different perspectives on it. I don't do it as much anymore because I just don't have the time, but I used to do that all the time.
Well, and it's also important not only to pay attention to those other viewpoints, like that is good, but really try to take their perspective, try to understand why. Like,
in other words, try to actually make them your own viewpoint, at least temporarily, see exactly where they're coming from and go, well, maybe they have a point.
Yeah.
You know, why people don't do it, one of the reasons offered is that then you open yourself up to a risk in terms of actually changing your mind on the subject.
Exactly.
You know, that's why the demonization process is effective. Because if you demonize the other, then nobody wants to even, you actually get intimidated psychologically to empathize and understand where they're coming from, because you don't want to actually start becoming like them and believing what they believe. That's why it's so effective. That's why people do it. I don't know if that made sense how I just said it.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah.
How much time do you have? Because we've been here for an hour and 20 minutes. Do you want to take some questions? And how long did you want to go?
About 10 more minutes.
Okay, so let's see if we have any questions. John, are you there?
Yes. Hey.
John,
yeah. Can you hear me, Craig? Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
Do we have questions? Did you like the discussion? You have anything?
Oh yeah. This was absolutely great. You were so like charismatic on screen, and like everybody in the chat was like totally with you. And then you started critiquing new atheism, and then they were like, "No, we hate him now." And then they turned back once you started.
Yeah, I knew it. I shouldn't have set him up for that, because I knew he'd ruffle feathers without even trying.
No, it was really good.
Kid's on fire.
Yeah.
Hey, before you ask a question, before I forget, do you want to do some play debates with us where we do problem of evil? They're not real debates. They're kind of just sparring, like, for fun debates.
I'm open to things like that. I mean, definitely, just reach out to me and maybe we can discuss something.
Okay, cool.
I can't commit to anything right now, but yeah, I mean, I'm open.
Yeah, no, I'm just in the future, potentially. Once I train up my guy, John, to be halfway decent at debating.
All right. Okay, so we had a couple questions going in, and if anybody else wants to put in some quick ones before we have to head out. But there was a question regarding your, I guess ethical system. I don't know if you have a particular one, just like maybe what you lean towards or so on.
That's a good question. So right now, we can divide the space, conceptual space, into meta ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. Okay, meta ethics asks questions like, what is the nature of morality? Are moral truths, do they even exist? Like, are they objective? Are they subjective? Do they even exist? Like, what are these things? Are they Platonic abstracta, or are they realized by complex nervous systems? What are these properties? What are moral properties? So that's meta ethics. Leaning towards metaphysics, I like that. That's my favorite out of the three. The second one is normative ethics. So normative ethics takes for granted usually a kind of moral realism and a kind of objectivism. So these truths are objective. And then it asks, okay, what kind of system should we use to sort of organize our behavior, and what moral system should we have? Should we be utilitarians? Is all that matters when you're making moral decisions, or is it the consequences? Is it this utility or pleasure maximization, or instead should we take a more virtue-based approach? Is it like is the good action something that flows from a good character or something like that, or is it a sort of deontological approach? Are good actions good in virtue of following some ethical principles or moral rules? It's all about rules and sort of rules governing it and maxims. So that's normative ethics. And then finally applied ethics, which looks at particular issues like euthanasia, abortion, same-sex marriage, killing in war, things like that, suicide, physician-assisted suicide, things like that. So that's a long background. I guess I can go through all three of them. I mean, with regard to meta ethics,
are you a moral realist of a type?
So that's what I was going to say here. In the first one, I lean towards moral realism. Yes. Again, everything is kind of leaning because I'm still researching all these things. I mean, I can't be saying I'm certain on these things. You know, the literature is so vast, but I lean towards moral realism. I think moral realism is in fact true. I think, moral truths are objective. I think that they are independent. I think that even if we were all brainwashed by the Nazis and the Nazis won World War II, Nazism would still be decidedly wrong. And so would fascism, and so would killing Jews. Those would all be so wrong. Even if we all were brainwashed into thinking they were wrong, they would be objectively and so bad wrong. And so that's meta ethics. I'm a moral realist and an objectivist. With respect to normative ethics, I lean towards something like a mixture of virtue ethics and deontology. Deontology is again like a rule-based approach. So I think that there are certain moral rules or moral axioms that we have to follow. And I also kind of integrate that with a kind of virtue theory. So I think that, good actions flow from good character. I think that, developing virtues like honesty and things like that are very important to the moral life. That's a sketch. And again, applied ethics is way too broad that, there are so many different issues that I can't really get into that. Right. That's a long-winded way to say that to answer your question, but hopefully that helps.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Joe. Okay. And that actually brings up a question I had myself. I remember in your devil's advocate debate with Randall Rouser that you had mentioned that of the arguments for God, and I think you also mentioned this in your video on agnosticism, you find that the argument from free will, like the existence of free will, to be something that you find to be like a good argument, I guess. Can you maybe go into that? Because I'm not sure how much people are really familiar with that type of argument.
Yeah. Okay, so background on free will. Philosophers are extremely divided on whether free will exists and what free will is. I am not incredibly confident in this area because I don't research it. And so, like I said, I research models of God, persistence, the metaphysics of persistence, and so on. So I don't really research free will too much. And so I don't have very committed and strong views. With that being said, I lean towards thinking free will probably exists in some sense, whether it's a compatibilist free will, which is to say compatibilism is just, even though our actions might be determined by causally prior conditions, we can nevertheless be free with respect to them. We can have a robust kind of freedom worth wanting, even though they're causally determined by prior conditions. Maybe our desires and our reasons, maybe, who knows? And then there's libertarianism, which says that we have this kind of irreducible agent causal power where we can choose to do otherwise, irrespective of our desires and our reasons. We have this sort of power, this sort of irreducible power. It's kind of mysterious, but just to do otherwise, to choose to do otherwise among a range of options. And so it rejects determinism in that sense. I'm not quite sure which of those models I want to take, but I lean towards thinking some kind of free will exists. I lean towards it.
Okay.
Now, that's the background. So now we have to ask, okay, let's just take as data that free will exists. Okay, now we can ask, well, what hypothesis about fundamental reality would best make sense of that? Well, it seems to me that theism makes better sense of that than naturalism, right? Because think of theism, right? Theism's resources. I mean, we have this personal, perfect, omnipotent being at the foundation of reality. And so this being would be capable of producing free agents. It would have motive. It would have a kind of desire to do that. Why? Because free will is so valuable. I mean, just think about it. That's free will is integral to our lives. It's how we build up relationships with one another. We aren't just these robots that are
right. It would be the whole point of God creating independent beings.
Exactly.
There'd be no point if they didn't have free will.
Yeah. And relationship with the Creator too. Like that. These things are so valuable. Under just objectively valuable, right? Free will, the relationships that it provides, the opportunity for moral growth, the opportunity for forgiveness. It's a sort of free forgiveness, not something that you're just a sort of like robotically coerced to do. I think that free will is very, very valuable. And I think that's a datum. Like that's regard. Like if free will exists and we're moral realists, I think that free will has objective value and a lot of it. And so what that means is that plausibly a theistic God would be motivated to produce agents with free will in a kind of moral arena that can facilitate relationships with the Creator, with one another, and so on. God would in some sense be motivated to do that, I think, because God's perfectly good. He's motivated towards the good. And so I think theism gives us good reason to at least expect to some degree that there would be free creatures, that there would be free will in a moral arena.
And in a naturalistic universe, consequently, would you say that would kind of mean more deterministic. People's behavior would be a lot more deterministic.
Or at
Would be
least
there.
less likely that free will
Yeah,
exists.
So how the argument would go is like, it wouldn't say that it's impossible, but like we can grant that it's possible. But naturalism, its fundamental building blocks. Remember, theism's fundamental reality is God with intentions and with desire for the good. But naturalism, its fundamental building blocks, that's indifferent to the flourishing and languishing of creatures, and it's indifferent to a moral landscape. It is indifferent to consciousness and free will, right? So although it might be possible for a naturalistic foundation, whether it be particles or quantum fields or what have you, although it might be possible somehow for them to give rise to these really valuable moral creatures, it seems not as expected as theism. Theism seems to provide a better explanation for how there is and how there could be these very complex moral arenas in which free will obtains. Whereas naturalism, you have to have a life-permitting universe. You have to have an evolutionary process that goes for a sufficiently long time with a sufficient amount of stability and complexity in order to even facilitate nervous systems that are even capable of having free will. You also need to have a kind of irreducible causal power, like you have to have some kind of reason-based action, right? Responsive to reasons, instead of just particles bashing into one another. You need this sort of irreducible causality. Again, there are a lot of hurdles that the naturalistic foundation, it seems not to provide good probabilistic resources so as to be able to produce that, or at least to make it probable. So on theism, it's much more probable, it seems, than on naturalism, and hence it would provide evidence by Bayes' theorem. It would provide evidence for theism over naturalism.
All other things being equal.
All else being equal. All else being equal.
Okay.
Now, let me just ask you a personal question, because from what I gathered talking to you, one of the things that you seem to think is the best evidence that there is not a God is that the universe, in fact, seems indifferent to us, objectively speaking. Correct? That there are things like tidal waves that don't care, or don't seem to care at all.
So I've got a lot of reasons. Like, again, I talk about this in my agnostic video. Why am I an agnostic? I have a lot of reasons on both sides. One of them, yes, is about the sort of the evolutionary process and how long and grueling and cruel it is. To my mind, it seems to be that's the cruelty of it, the sheer cruelty, and the fact that if God exists, this would be his very means or mechanism by which he creates. I do think that provides also some evidence for naturalism over theism. So, like, I guess the audience who's listening, they're gonna be happy with me, because if they're a naturalist, they're gonna be like, "Yay, he said hey," and then if they're a theist,
he scored some points.
He
scored some points for our squad. First he shredded us, and now he's like building us back up. See, he's gonna build you back up again, guys. Don't run away from him. First he shreds your bad ideas, then he's like, "Okay, here's some good ideas in defense of your."
The atheists in the chat have been going on about how they're going through a roller coaster of emotions just because he's like one time singing their praises and also like utterly demolishing them. It's been very enjoyable.
I'm for more questions, because I'm enjoying this. So I mean, I have some time for a few more questions.
Just on that topic of the nature of animal suffering, I agree with you. That's probably one of the hardest cases to really contend with as a theist. I'm curious of, I guess, maybe your takeaway with Trent Doherty, because it was you and another person on their channel, right? And you are all wearing hats. It was really fun video. But what do you how do you sort of take his, I guess, theodicy that the sort of animals do have souls, or at least that's an open sort of option for the theists, that animals do have souls, they undergo some sort of not reimbursement, but some sort of justification for the suffering that they might experience. Yeah, through their experience on Earth, all over the course of those millions of years. If for any of those instances where they do suffer unjustifiably, or what would immediately look to be unjustifiably.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And well, properly answering that would take like probably hours upon hours. But long story short, I think it's very interesting. I think it's one of the most plausible ways that the theist is going to be able to take it. I do think that they're going to have to say that there's some sort of animal afterlife. Animals are going to be, in some sense, I guess, united with God and somehow are going to benefit from that.
Some sort of like theosis.
Yeah, as well. Exactly. Okay. See, now what's difficult with this is that, well, it seems as though it's going to lower the prior probability of theism, because now we're including a lot more stuff in our ontology. We've got animal afterlife, we've got animal theosis, we've got animals with these souls, We've got we have to talk about their persistence conditions, right? Like it's already difficult to explain how humans could survive their deaths somehow. Like, is it our souls that go and maybe our bodies are like reconstituted? So it's already difficult with humans, and it's already difficult to knock down or to pin down our precise persistence conditions. That is to say, the conditions under which we retain personal identity. It's very difficult to see how you're going to do this with an animal that's non-rational, that doesn't have these, that at least doesn't seem to have this robust kind of psychological, rational continuity in its life. Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult for me to wrap my mind around these persistence conditions problems. You know, it's going to lower the prior probability of the hypothesis because you're adding in a lot of stuff. You're adding in a lot of auxiliary hypotheses.
That's a good point, because like under naturalism, when you're referring to the grounding of being, all you have to talk about is that. But when you're, I guess, talking about theism, a perfect, all-loving, all good God, now you're having to include other things that also exist in this ontology, such as animals, souls, and human souls, and heaven and hell and things like that as well. Okay, that's a really interesting.
And then the third thing that I would bring up, I mean, in addition to like what others have written on it, like Beth Seekert and, you know, different philosophers have responded at least a little bit to his work. I mean, the third thing is, you know, there is that worry that like the distinction between justification and compensation.
Right.
So, I mean, imagine that I came up to you and, well, I'm not going to do this with you. Imagine I came up to...
No, go ahead.
Imagine I came to take it. Do it to him.
Metal bat.
Makes it more interesting for the audience.
I've got this metal bat. I'm looking around to see if I have anything.
Awesome. Okay. Do it to John.
Here's my metal bat. It's the ethics. It's funny because it's the ethics to it. So
you're beating me to death with an ethics book.
So I got my ethics metal bat. I'm going to whack you in the head as hard as I can. And when you wake up, I'm gonna be like, oh, here's $1 million. That makes up for it. Here's $1 million or $10 million. And like that's not.
I take it in a second. I take that in a second. Oh my God, do it.
But the thing is, that doesn't justify me in hitting you in the head in the first place. Like, no, I shouldn't have done that in the first place. Why?
But if the whole of creation is if it's a fallen creation and there's some sort of, you know, cosmic significance to living through this veil of tears and it's all redeemed in the end, then it justifies the entirety. That's like, you know, the creation itself cries out for the day when the sons of God will be revealed. So the whole of creation, some aspects of Christian theology, is all of creation is affected by the fall. That's what Dry Apologist was accounting for. That's why I liked his theodicy, because he's the only person I've ever heard try to account for it all. But
yeah. So yeah, well, I was just bringing out the distinction with that lively example. So yeah, I mean, intuitively, it seems that my giving you $10 million or $1 million, that doesn't justify me in what I did originally, and it's
right.
Just,
but you also helped me grow as a person, because now I have to forgive you, and there's a lot going on. It's not.
I know. I'm just articulating the distinction.
Right. And probably the point that you could make is that there's a difference between somebody voluntarily entering into a situation in which they could undergo some sort of suffering and then be compensated for it, other than besides somebody being forced into a situation where they have to undergo some sort of suffering and then later compensated for it.
Yeah, well, that's a very good distinction as well. And so yeah, there's that sort of voluntary aspect to it, and there's also another aspect, which is just, you know, I still wasn't justified in hitting you originally, even if, you know, I compensated you for it. I need to, you know, that it wasn't a morally sufficient reason for me to hit you on the head that I would just, you know, compensate you with you for it. So there is that distinction, and it's hard to like sort of track that line in this animal suffering theodicy. You know, right. Giving them an infinite afterlife. We need to flesh out more why this is a morally sufficient reason for allowing or causing them to go through such treacherous pain in the earthly life. It's difficult to navigate that.
Could I sum it up like this? Let me see if you're happy with this. With human beings, it's really easy to find a morally sufficient parable for why such things happen, and this happened because of this reason, and like it's part of a trial or something like that. But it's literally almost impossible if you factor in the animal kingdom. Literally almost impossible. Still could maybe be done, but it's much harder to do. Is that kind of is that a way of summing it all up, or no?
Yeah, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's much harder. So yeah, I would say
it's much harder. I mean, I just mean it like really hard to do if you factor. With humans, it's easy. if you factor in the animal kingdom and like all the lions that have been, all the zebras, that poor little zebras that got eaten over the years. And
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it's easy for humans, because there are these evils called horrendous evils where, well, that's getting a little bit ahead of myself, but like, yeah, stubbing my toe, that's probably easy. It's easier.
Well, but you can fashion it all into, it's fairly easy because you can make it all into parable of morality, where we don't have to go down this rabbit hole. We'll do that some other time if we talk about this. I don't mean easy like takes 2 minutes. I mean easy like doable. Easy to see how it's doable. Okay, John, we have any more questions? Where'd he go?
We had a question. Am I still here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. We had a question on your thoughts on Igtheism. And maybe if you could explain that as well, if you're familiar with the term. Igtheism. I think it's like apatheism, I think it just means that all God concepts are incoherent and don't really refer to anything. You can't exactly say that gods do or do not exist, because the very concept God either has some sort of like incoherency just built within it. Like it's some sort of something that exists but is immaterial, and only material things exist. Therefore, there's a contradiction, I guess, if you're a materialist, to say that Igtheism is just an incoherent concept.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I have to think about it further. I mean, my main thing is I'm just going to say something like prove it. I mean, if someone is claiming that a concept is incoherent, the onus of justification is on them to show and, precisely give out this deduction of the incoherency. And, arguably theists are going to be like, well, hold on a second, that premise right there begs the question, or maybe that inference is non sequitur, or here's an underlying assumption that no theist would ever grant you, or maybe you're making use of dubious metaphysical assumptions. I don't know. My point is just that I'm not convinced by such arguments, or at least some such arguments. And so I'd have to ask them for their proof of that claim. So that's my main thoughts on it.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's similar, or maybe it has some like similar background as in theological non-cognitivism of sort of like A.J. Ayer in the logical positives back in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, man, I like lost the window. There we go. Okay, Zoom, I can see your face again. Okay, yeah, well, maybe let's see if we have like any more questions. I think we're almost out though. Let's see, I did have a question. Well, yeah, like everybody's just been fully encapsulated with your just style and the way that you express your ideas. Everybody's been loving it. It's been so good. And
kids on fire,
really
John.
Appreciative.
This is your role model. Except for him being agnostic, this is your role model. This is how I want you to become.
No, even still. Yeah, same. I'm exactly the same. Like I really appreciated that conversation you had with Josh Rasmussen, of going over sort of the epistemic and intellectual virtues one can exhibit during a conversation between people that disagree with one another. It's something that I wish a lot more people would try to embody in these types of debates online, and even just conversations, and as well all the stuff that you do on your channel where you're hosting these debates in a sort of more conversational manner, and actually not just actually honing in on a single sort of idea, which is excellent. Like actually going into like whether divine simplicity works or doesn't quite work with the Trinity, just because that's a really specific idea. People can really elaborate and go into it as much as is necessary. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's great because they're like experts on these things. So it's like I have the experts like literally going in and like, digging into the deepest depths. And it's nice. It's nice that I sort of have a sort of training, a background in philosophy that I can also kind of engage with them when they're discussing. I can help clarify ideas and things like that. Like one of my favorite moments, I'm not like bragging. One of my favorite moments was like Graham Oppie when he was discussing with Rob Coons. And Rob Coons made a point and Graham Oppie was like, Joe, can you help? And I was just, yeah. So
What? You're kidding.
I tried explaining what Rob Coons said in just different words, and I think it helped. It helped get it back on track. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. Please, people, don't think that I'm trying to toot my own horn. What I'm just trying to say is that I think you'll enjoy my channel because I also have a philosophical background that I can also help engage these thinkers in ways that certain other hosts wouldn't be able to do. I'm not trying to toot my own horn. I'm just saying that that's a benefit of my channel.
Totally. Did you see Trent Doherty
and the other
versus?
thing I wanted to ask you about. Oh, go ahead, Craig.
Did you see Trent Doherty versus Aaron Ra? Just out of curiosity.
To be honest, I try to stay away from
those type of debates.
Yeah. I mean, like I would rather like read a philosophy paper like in an article, but especially if it's like. I hate to be rude, but if it's Aaron Ra, I mean, from what I have seen, I don't think it reaches a level of philosophical rigor that I would be interested in. That's what I'm going to say.
Okay.
Very good. We had a question from Salem, another young kid that we love on this channel. What is a popular argument for God that you think doesn't work? Like, and is really bad if you would even go so far as to say.
It's funny. There are actually a number of them. So there's this thing called causal finitism. Now, causal finitism is the view that all causal chains are finite. Causal chains like A causes B, B causes C, C causes D. It says that all causal chains are finite. There are some really interesting arguments for this. And so what this leads to, well, if all causal chains are finite, well, then there's at least one uncaused first cause, right? I mean, if all causal chains are finite, just zoom into that first member, and by definition, it's not caused in the respect of the chain, right? And so that gets you to a kind of Kalam cosmological argument, and Alexander Pruss and Rob Coons have developed this in their professional work. They've published papers and journal articles and books on this. And so that is one way that I think is a respectable way to argue for the Kalam cosmological argument. But I don't think that the sort of more traditional Kalam cosmological argument, or at least its second premise that the universe began to exist, those kinds of arguments, I'm going to be honest with you, I think they fall flat on their face. I think they're so bad. I mean, it's like the arguments from successive addition, things like that, and like Hilbert's Hotel. I don't find those convincing at all. Like Hilbert's Hotel, there's no contradiction that you derive from it. It just seems a little odd, but like, I don't know, like I'm really familiar. I mean, again, this is something that Proust says, but it's something that I say as well. Like, I'm really familiar with the sort of the Cantorian set theory that we've inherited. And so it's no surprise to me whatsoever that you can manipulate the hotel rooms in such a way that you can accommodate a new guest. Like, that's not surprising at all. That's precisely what we should expect if there could be in actual infinites. So at least to my mind, the traditional justifications for that second premise of the Kalam are, I'm just going to, from my perspective, are very bad. And I've talked on some of them on that friend's channel, Micah, his Crusade Against Ignorance. I talked about some of them with Dr. Alex Malpass, who's written extensively on these in his published work. He has he actually has a forthcoming one in the journal Mind, which is like the second most prestigious journal in all of philosophy, a peer-reviewed journal. And he has a forthcoming one, and it's on the successive addition argument. And I think he does really well to argue against the successive addition argument for the second premise of the Kalam. Long story short, the traditional kind of Kalam, I don't think is that good. But more causal finitist versions, I think they're more respectable. I'm going to give one more. I don't like a kind of traditional moral argument. I mean, maybe that's an unpopular thing to say, but I just think I think it's just not the case that, well, oftentimes it seems to bleed into divine command theory. And I just think divine command theory is very, very implausible. For a variety of reasons. There are epistemological problems, there are ontological problems for it, but and it just seems that that first premise, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. I find that just deeply implausible. And I guess if listeners want an introduction to this, I mean, definitely check out Shelley Kagan's debate with Dr. William Lane Craig. Yes. So long story short, I'm not convinced, and I don't think it's that good. The traditional moral argument and the traditional Kalam.
Did they just debate that? Is that what they were debating?
Oh yeah. So Shelley Kagan, yeah, they were just debating that moral argument.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those
I
two,
haven't seen
I
that.
know there are contemporary versions that I find much more interesting. So for the kalam, there's that causal finitist kalam, which is a new development, which is much more plausible. And for moral arguments, there's a kind of what's called in the literature evolutionary debunking arguments. It's a technical sense of the term debunking, where you basically take the facts of evolution and say that it provides some sort of defeater for our confidence in our moral intuitions or our moral seemings. And so that's actually a very interesting argument. When you combine that with naturalism, you might, some people have argued, like Dr. Thomas Bogardus, he argues that under naturalism, we get a defeater for moral realism. Whereas if we had theism, we wouldn't get such a defeater. So it's
would
an
it be a
interesting
defeater for moral realism, or would it be a defeater for moral knowledge? Like it would just sort of be an undercutter to all our apprehensions of moral beliefs.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So I was speaking very, unfortunately, very imprecisely there. So thank you for correcting me. I definitely was intended to convey, but I did not convey. Unfortunately, I would go back and slap myself if I could. Harder than I hit you with a bat. I'd slap myself and I'd tell myself, you should have said moral knowledge there. Yes, it's a defeater for moral knowledge. If successful,
Right. Yeah, and kind of like going off of the case. Okay, so if we are just evolved creatures, we would only evolve intuitions that would be more supportive for our own species to survive, or even our own kin to survive. And those are the types of intuitions that we would have for what is moral and what is immoral. And then, so the fact that we have other intuitions towards, say, like even people in outside tribes, like some sort of empathy, or towards other animals as well, that would be a strong, this is like, I guess maybe something strange that would occur under naturalism. Is that kind of the way the argument goes, or is it something?
It's similar to that. It's basically like, it's basically saying like, listen, evolution easily could have made us, if there isn't like a God directing it, evolution easily could have made us, could have formed us in such a way so as to have moral intuitions that deeply diverge from our actual moral intuitions, but that which we would have thought were correctly latching onto the moral truths, but yet we in our current intuitions think are just absurd. So like termites, for instance, they like eat their dead and they like cannibalize, like it's weird. A bunch of different animals do horrendous things in the animal kingdom. And had we evolved in that way, likely we would have had moral intuitions. They're like, oh, that's so beautiful. Like that person is killing his own son and cannibalizing him. Like, that's so beautiful. Like we would have had, like, if that were conducive, if we evolved that way, likely we would have had intuitions and our moral seemings would have latched onto that, because that's what promotes survival. And so that's the general line of argument. And so what it says is like, okay, if we easily could have gone wrong, then, we don't, our faculty isn't reliable because it easily could have gone wrong. Like if you have a temperature, if you have a thermometer that is like, it easily could be wrong. It could tell you 30 degrees. It could tell you 70 degrees. That's not going to give you knowledge if it's that temperature, if it's that thermometer. So that's the general line of argument. There are different ways to respond to it. There are, the literature is very vast. I'm just saying, my main point is just that this is more plausible than the traditional moral argument, which talks about moral ontology. This one talks about moral epistemology. And I think this is much stronger and more robust than this. I think that this argument is just bleh. Like, I don't like it.
What about, say, somebody from, like, say, J.L. Mackie, who was a moral error theorist, who thought that if there were these sorts of like moral obligations or moral values, these would be sort of like very queer objects in our ontology. That like, okay, it doesn't correspond with any natural fact of any sort. It's rather saying this word ought or what we should do, and none of this really corresponds with the facts of any sort of ontology. How would the non-naturalistic moral realists sort of respond to that?
Yeah, well, it is important to say, like, the terminology is unfortunate, because someone who's a metaphysical naturalist who thinks that causal reality is just spatiotemporal reality, they can be a non-naturalist with respect to moral realism, because that just kind of talks about moral properties, which aren't really causally spatiotemporal things. That would kind of fit more with a kind of Platonic naturalism. And so it is okay for naturalists to be, in that sense, non-naturalists with respect to morality. The right. Terminology is rough, but there are also what's called moral naturalists, as you know, and they think that moral properties either supervene on or are grounded in or are identical to various natural properties, maybe like they're realized in nervous systems or they're realized in suffering, or so the naturalist has a lot of options. As for your question, how the moral non-naturalist is going to respond, I think that they're just going to respond like, listen, bro, like, you can say that these things are strange or weird or queer, but like, I have all these arguments that are telling me that this is true, and so you can just screw off. I mean, that's really what they're going to say to him. They're going to be like, listen, bro, like we have all these reasons to think that moral realism is true. We have all these reasons to think that they can't be natural facts, and so they would have to be these sort of Platonic and non-natural facts. And so just deal with it. I mean, reality sometimes is weird. I mean, can you explain consciousness? I mean, natural facts, those are hella weird. I mean, what the hell is a particle? Think about it. What's an electron? Is it just a cloud of probability? What the hell is a cloud? That's a metaphor. That's what we look at the sky towards. A cloud of probability on the subatomic level. What the hell are you talking about? Are they little billiard balls? That doesn't make any sense. Like, well, that's an abstraction from our ordinary experience. And physics tells us that that's bull crap. So yeah, just zoom in. Like, a cloud of probability. Like, I don't know. Everything is queer. Like, that's what I want to say. Hashtag everything's queer. If you really try to think about something, the longer you think about it, the queerer it gets. I'm telling you. Think about consciousness. It's not, I don't know. You can see that I'm not in any way threatened by his argument from queerness. I think if you think about it, pretty much everything is queer. And everything is weird. Natural facts, like, what are those? Like, it's weird. Electrons are super weird. Consciousness is weird. It's not an objection to these properties to say that they're queer. That's my view. That's my response. That's
a good point. Like, you could even almost say, like, I don't know if you'd want to go so far, but I could say that the sort of drawing this line in the sand between queer and non-queer objects of our ontology is almost a bit of epistemic closed-mindedness, in that, like, the things that we're more familiar with, what we're able to explain better, we're going to stick with those and not kind of toe the line and maybe try to explore further than what we fully understand right now. Even though, as you pointed out, most of our natural facts we don't fully understand right now, like, what is aboutness in consciousness, and, like, what does it mean for something. There's also probably my favorite argument against sort of the Mackies, or even the moral non-cognitivists, is the argument from basically that any sort of epistemic justification is a sort of normative property in a sort of non-natural way.
Like a normative web, kind of.
The argument from sorry, yeah.
Oh, it was you were lagging out just a little bit. Maybe I was. Who knows? But yeah, that's kind of the route that. Sorry to interrupt you, but that's kind of the route Terence Cuneo takes in his book, The Normative Web. Basically saying, like, listen, like, these epistemic facts, like, surely we think that you ought to pursue the truth. Like, it's just not the case that you ought to pursue falsehood, and you ought to, like, you ought not to value evidence. I mean, skeptics, they're always, like, skeptics and atheists, they're like, listen, the truth is valuable, right? Like, you ought to pursue the truth. You ought not to, like, pursue falsehood and maximize false beliefs. Like, what? Like, no, that's not what you should be doing. And so that's a kind of epistemic normativity. And, like, if you're confronted with an argument that's deductive and sound, and it's sound, like, there's a certain sense in which, you have an epistemic norm to accept the conclusion, because that it's sound, it's convincing argument, and so on. And so, yeah, there is that kind of epistemic normativity. And I mean, that's going to be just as queer as any moral normativity. I mean, it's the same kind of, it's just normativity, right? It's this oughtness, it's this property. I mean, yeah, so if he accepts that, then it seems as though he's going to have to deny kind of fundamental intuitions about rationality itself, which is rough. But I'm guessing that's going to probably, unfortunately, be our last question. It was definitely, yeah,
definitely. Yeah. That should.
All right.
That's
thank you.
Yeah, that was. So are we wrapping up? That was the last question. What, you want to say something before we let you go?
Well, I do want to say thank you guys both. I really appreciated it. This was fun. Yeah, I mean, peeps, if you want to check out my YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason, to all the listeners, you can just click subscribe. If you want, you can turn on that little bell, that notification. I mean, unfortunately, YouTube doesn't like to let you see, like, when it promotes other videos that you don't want to see, and it kind of almost, like, the algorithms are horrible. My point is just to hit that.
The algorithms used to be good. I used to get like really cool stuff sent to me, and I was like, wait, where did this come from? Now I get weird. Now it's like, I don't know, if you click on a video, like 2 music videos, all of a sudden you get like 10. You're like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
But But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But yeah, no, it's true. So yeah, if you want, click subscribe, but also click on that little bell. That's really important for YouTube algorithms now. So that's what I want to.
And I have your
thank
channel in the description below,
Okay.
as well as a link to your blog as well, so everybody
Okay.
can go to there. And I'd also recommend to go buy his book. I haven't gotten mine yet, but I'm planning on reading it, and I'm very interested in. Yes, it's so cool that you're only 20 years old and you've already written like a 200+ page book, and it's a lot of the at least stuff that I've heard of it from your different conversations. I'm really looking.
Yes, that brings me so much joy. So thank you so much, and yeah, thank you both guys for this interview. That was so wonderful.
Kid's on fire, people. 20 years old. What were you guys doing when you're 20 years old? Nothing. He's got books under his belt, and he's, you know, destroying Josh Rasmussen in YouTube debates. So the kid's on fire. You heard it here. He was like rapid fire, machine gun intellect, pretty thorough. Give us pretty good, thorough introduction to a lot of the stuff you deal with. So hopefully we'll have you back pretty soon. And this was actually a really fun chat. And with that, we will say goodbye to our new friend. John, you want to take us home?
Yes, I have